The morning sun cast long shadows across forward operating Base Kestrel when Captain Raven Blackthorne stepped off the transport helicopter, her worn flight jacket catching the desert wind. The assembled Marines barely glanced up from their morning briefing, their attention focused on the hulking figure of Gunnery Sergeant Martinez as he outlined the day's patrol routes. What they didn't notice was the way Raven's eyes swept the compound with practiced precision, cataloging defensive positions and escape routes with the instincts of someone who had learned to survive in places where survival wasn't guaranteed. 3 weeks earlier, a reconnaissance drone had captured footage that would change everything. Deep in the Kandahar province, satellite imagery revealed what appeared to be a massive weapons cache hidden beneath an abandoned Soviet-era airfield. The cache wasn't just ammunition. Intelligence suggested it contained advanced surface-to-air missiles that could down any aircraft within a 50-mile radius. The problem was location. The airfield sat in a valley so narrow that traditional bombing runs were impossible, surrounded by civilian villages that made surgical strikes politically untenable. It would require precision that only came from boots on the ground. Command needed someone who could fly low and fast through mountain passes that would make seasoned pilots break into cold sweats. They needed someone who understood both air and ground operations, someone who could coordinate between worlds that rarely spoke the same language. They needed Captain Raven Blackthorne, though most of the Marines at FOB Kestrel didn't know her reputation yet. The laughter started when she approached the weapons tent. Staff Sergeant Cooper, a barrel-chested man with arms like tree trunks, was demonstrating proper rifle stance to a group of fresh-faced Marines when Raven walked up and quietly asked to requisition an M4A1. Cooper's weathered face cracked into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, with respect, maybe you'd be more comfortable with a sidearm. These rifles got a bit more kick than what you flygirls are used to." The circle of Marines erupted in barely suppressed chuckles. Their attention suddenly focused on the petite woman who stood before them in desert camouflage that looked like it had seen more combat zones than most of their careers combined. Raven's expression remained neutral, but those who knew her would have recognized the slight tightening around her eyes, a tell that had preceded some of the most decisive moments in her military career. She extended her hand toward the rifle with the calm patience of someone who had learned that proving herself was a ritual she would perform again and again, in every new unit, on every new deployment, until the day she finally hung up her wings. The morning that would define Captain Raven Blackthorne's legacy at FOB Kestrel began like any other, with the distant rumble of supply helicopters and the metallic clink of equipment being checked and rechecked. She had arrived at the base 3 days prior as part of a classified joint operation, her personnel file sealed at levels that made even the base commander ask fewer questions than he normally would. The Marines knew only that she was a pilot on temporary assignment for specialized consultation, a designation vague enough to inspire both curiosity and skepticism among the rank and file. Staff Sergeant Cooper had been running the same weapons proficiency course for 8 years, and he prided himself on being able to size up a Marine's shooting ability before they ever touched a rifle. When Captain Blackthorne approached his training area that morning, requesting access to the range, Cooper saw what he expected to see: a pilot out of her element, trying to play soldier. Her small frame and quiet demeanor only reinforced his assumptions. "Tell you what, Captain," he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone explaining something to a child. "Why don't you start with some dry-fire exercises? Get a feel for the weapon before we put live rounds downrange." The gathered Marines exchanged knowing glances. This was entertainment, a break from the monotonous routine of desert patrols and equipment maintenance. They formed a loose semicircle around the firing line, some pretending to clean their own weapons while others openly watched with amused interest. Private Morrison, barely 19 and fresh from basic training, nudged his buddy with an elbow. "$10 says she can't hit the broad side of a barn," he whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Raven accepted the M4A1 with the respectful care of someone who understood that weapons demanded reverence, regardless of the circumstances. Her hands moved over the rifle with practiced efficiency, checking the chamber, testing the action, adjusting the stock to accommodate her shorter frame. Cooper noticed her movements were precise, but attributed it to basic military training rather than genuine expertise. What he missed was the way her breathing automatically regulated itself, the subtle shift in her stance that spoke of muscle memory developed through countless hours of practice. The target stood 200 meters downrange, a standard silhouette that had absorbed thousands of rounds from Marines learning their trade. Cooper handed her a magazine loaded with 20 rounds of 5.56 ammunition, then stepped back with his arms crossed, preparing to offer guidance when she inevitably struggled with the rifle's recoil. The morning air carried the scent of cordite from earlier training sessions, mixed with the ever-present dust that coated everything at Fob Kestrel. In the distance, the mountains stood like silent sentinels, their peaks lost in the haze of another day in Afghanistan's unforgiving landscape. The transformation began the moment Captain Blackthorne settled into her firing position. The casual observer might have missed it, the subtle way her body aligned itself with the weapon, how her breathing fell into the rhythm that every expert marksman knew by heart. Staff Sergeant Cooper, despite his preconceptions, possessed enough experience to recognize that something had changed in the woman before him. The nervous energy that he had mistaken for inexperience had crystallized into something else entirely: absolute focus. Raven's left hand found its position on the rifle's handguard with the muscle memory of someone who had performed this action thousands of times before. Her right hand settled around the pistol grip, index finger resting alongside the trigger guard, until the moment came to fire. The Marines watching from the sidelines began to quiet as they noticed the professional manner in which she handled the weapon, though most still expected entertainment rather than expertise. "Take your time, Captain," Cooper called out, his voice carrying across the range. "Remember, squeeze the trigger straight back, don't jerk it." His advice, while well-intentioned, revealed his continued assumption that he was dealing with someone who needed basic instruction. What he couldn't have known was that Raven Blackthorne had earned her marksmanship before she ever learned to fly, that her path to aviation had begun not in flight simulators, but on ranges much more demanding than this one. The rifle seemed to shrink in her hands as she brought it to her shoulder, the stock settling into the pocket between her shoulder and collarbone with practiced ease. Her cheek found its place on the stock, creating the consistent sight picture that separated professional shooters from weekend enthusiasts. Through the iron sights, the target downrange came into sharp focus while everything else, the watching Marines, Cooper's commentary, even the ambient noise of the base, faded into irrelevance. Private Morrison shifted uncomfortably as he watched her preparations, beginning to suspect that his $10 bet might have been premature. There was something in the way she held herself, a stillness that spoke of deep competence rather than nervousness. Lance Corporal Hayes, who had deployed twice before and learned to read people under pressure, elbowed Morrison and whispered, "Maybe keep that $10 in your pocket, boot." The first shot came without fanfare or dramatic pause. One moment the range held the familiar sounds of a training exercise in progress. The next it erupted with the sharp crack of high-velocity ammunition, leaving the barrel of an M4A1. The sound echoed off the surrounding structures before fading into the vast emptiness of the Afghan landscape, leaving behind a silence that seemed heavier than the noise that had preceded it. Time seemed suspended in the heartbeat following that first shot. The Marines who had been watching with casual amusement found themselves leaning forward, straining to see the target downrange through their binoculars and rifle scopes. Staff Sergeant Cooper reached for his own spotting scope, expecting to provide the gentle correction that would help the captain improve her next attempt. What he saw through the magnified optics made him pause and adjust the focus, certain that his eyes were playing tricks on him. The target, which moments before had been pristine white paper marked only with the black silhouette outline, now bore a single hole precisely centered in what marksmen call the X-ring, not just the bull's but the tiny circle within the bulls that separated good shooters from exceptional ones. Cooper blinked hard and looked again, then slowly lowered his spotting scope to study the woman who had just made what many of his Marines couldn't achieve on their best days. Raven had already cycled the bolt and acquired her sight picture for the second shot, her breathing controlled and steady. If she was aware of the stunned silence spreading among her audience, she gave no indication. Her world had narrowed to the fundamental elements of marksmanship: sight alignment, breathing, trigger control, and follow-through. Everything else was noise. The second shot followed barely 3 seconds after the first, its report identical in every way except for the hole it punched through the paper target. This one landed less than half an inch from the first, creating what experienced shooters called a touching group, two shots so close together that their edges overlapped. Private Morrison's mouth fell open as he tracked the shot placement through his rifle scope, while Lance Corporal Hayes simply shook his head and muttered something about never judging a book by its cover. Cooper found himself in unfamiliar territory. In 8 years of running the range at FOB Kestrel, he had seen Marines who were natural shots and others who struggled to hit a target at 50 meters. He had worked with snipers whose precision bordered on supernatural, and with green recruits who couldn't hit the ground if they fell off their boots. But he had never seen anyone fire 2 shots with such casual precision, while surrounded by an audience expecting her to fail. His mind raced to recalibrate his assumptions about the woman, who continued to fire with methodical precision. The 3rd through 10th shots followed in a rhythm that spoke of deep training and deeper discipline. Each report echoed across the range with mechanical regularity, and each hole appeared in the target with the kind of consistency that made seasoned marksmen take notice. By the 10th shot, the laughter had died completely. The semicircle of Marines had tightened into a cluster of focused observers, each trying to process what they were witnessing. Staff Sergeant Cooper made no pretense of looking through his spotting scope anymore. He simply watched Captain Blackthorn work, nodding the way she never broke her cheek weld, how her breathing remained steady throughout the string of fire, and how her trigger finger reset with the precision of a Swiss watch. The 11th through 15th shots continued the pattern, each one finding its way into a group that was rapidly becoming the stuff of legend. Word began to spread beyond the immediate audience as Marines from other areas of the base wandered over to see what was causing the commotion. Gunnery Sergeant Martinez appeared at the edge of the crowd, his weathered face betraying nothing as he observed the scene through narrow eyes that had seen combat in 3 different theaters. Shot 16 landed so close to Shot 7 that it was impossible to tell where one hole ended and the other began. 17 followed 8 heartbeats later, enlarging the group by mere millimeters. 18, 19, and 20 came in steady succession, each one adding to a cluster of holes that would be talked about in mess halls and barracks for months to come. When Captain Blackthorn finally lowered her rifle and engaged the safety, the silence stretched like a held breath across the entire range. She turned to Staff Sergeant Cooper with the same neutral expression she had worn throughout the exercise, as if what had just transpired was nothing more than a routine qualification shoot. "Would you like me to retrieve the target, Sergeant?" she asked, her voice carrying no hint of satisfaction or smugness, just the practical question of someone ready to move on to the next task. Cooper managed to nod, though his mind was still processing the impossibility of what he had just witnessed. 20 shots, 200 meters, and a group that could be covered by a silver dollar. He had seen Marine Corps competition shooters who would be proud of such shooting, had worked with reconnaissance Marines whose lives depended on such precision, but he had never seen it delivered so casually, with so little apparent effort. Private Morrison fumbled for his wallet, certain that he owed someone money, while Lance Corporal Hayes just shook his head in amazement. The crowd of observers began to murmur among themselves, their voices carrying a new note of respect that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. Someone in the back of the group whistled low and long, the sound expressing what words couldn't quite capture. The walk downrange to retrieve the target felt longer than 200 meters for everyone involved. Staff Sergeant Cooper accompanied Captain Blackthorne, ostensibly to verify the target, but really because he needed to see the evidence up close to believe it. The Marines followed in a loose group, their earlier amusement replaced by something approaching reverence. The target told the story in 20 neat holes clustered in an area smaller than Cooper's fist. Most of the holes overlapped, creating a ragged opening that looked like a single large tear rather than 20 separate impacts. The scoring rings around the bulls remained largely untouched except for that devastating central cluster. Cooper had seen plenty of impressive shooting in his career, but this transcended impressive and entered the realm of the extraordinary. "Jesus Christ, Captain," he said, forgetting protocol in his amazement. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither fully understood yet. Around them, the Marines examined the target with the kind of quiet all usually reserved for religious experiences or natural disasters. Captain Blackthorne studied the target with the dispassionate eye of someone evaluating her own work. "I started shooting when I was 7, she said simply, as if that explained everything. "My father believed that every skill worth having was worth perfecting." She paused, her gaze moving from the shredded paper to the mountains beyond the base. "He taught me that precision under pressure wasn't just about marksmanship. It was about discipline, focus, and the ability to perform when everything around you was falling apart." The weight of those words settled over the group like dust kicked up by a passing convoy. Here was context that began to make sense of what they had witnessed, though it raised as many questions as it answered. Cooper found himself studying the woman beside him with new eyes, wondering what other assumptions he had made that were about to be proven spectacularly wrong. As they walked back toward the firing line, the Marines' conversation buzzed with speculation and analysis. The mood had shifted completely from the mockery that had greeted Captain Blackthorne's arrival to something approaching professional respect. Private Morrison, still stunned by what he had witnessed, finally managed to find his voice. "Ma'am," he called out, "what's your actual job in the Air Force?" The question carried more weight than its simple phrasing suggested. It was really asking who she was, what she did, and how someone with her obvious skills had ended up at their remote outpost. The Marines gathered around, sensing that they were about to learn something important about the woman who had just redefined their understanding of what was possible. Captain Blackthorne paused in her walk back to the firing line, considering how much to reveal. Her assignment to FOB Kestrel was classified at levels that made casual conversation about her background impossible, but the question deserved some kind of answer. The Marines around her had just witnessed something that challenged their assumptions about her capabilities, and she owed them at least a glimpse of the truth. "I'm a pilot," she said, which they already knew. "But before I learned to fly, I learned to fight on the ground. My father was Army Special Forces, 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Somalia, 1 in the Gulf. He believed that knowing how to use a rifle was as fundamental as knowing how to walk." She shouldered her weapon with practiced ease, the M4A1 looking natural in her hands despite her slight frame. "He used to say that flying was just another form of marksmanship, precision at distance under pressure, when failure wasn't an option." Staff Sergeant Cooper nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. "What kind of pilot, Captain? Transport? Close air support?" His questions carried the weight of someone trying to understand how the different pieces of Captain Blackthorne's skill set fit together. The shooting they had just witnessed wasn't the hobby marksmanship of someone who flew cargo planes. It was the precision of someone whose life had depended on accuracy under pressure. "Attack helicopter," she replied, and suddenly everything clicked into focus. The steady hands, the absolute calm under observation, the precision that bordered on supernatural, these were the traits that kept helicopter pilots alive in environments where the margin for error was measured in microseconds. Apache longbow primarily. Some Black Hawk work when they needed pilots who could handle complicated situations. The Marines exchanged glances that carried new understanding. Attack helicopter pilots lived in a world where precision meant the difference between eliminating a threat and creating a catastrophe, where steady hands and perfect timing kept both aircraft and ground forces alive. The shooting they had just witnessed wasn't an anomaly. It was the manifestation of skills honed in far more demanding circumstances than a training range could ever provide. Lance Corporal Hayes, who had served as a forward observer and understood the relationship between ground forces and close air support, looked at Captain Blackthorne with something approaching awe. "How many combat hours, Captain?" he asked, his question carrying the respectful tone of someone who recognized they were speaking to a warrior, not just a pilot. "Enough to know that the ground and the air are just different pieces of the same battlefield," she replied. "And enough to understand that every Marine down there depends on the pilot up here getting it exactly right, exactly when it matters most." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, whose approach had been noted by the Marines with the kind of automatic awareness that came from months of living under his command. Martinez was a legend at FOB Kestrel, a veteran of Fallujah and Helmand Province, whose judgment was trusted implicitly by every Marine under his command. His opinion of Captain Blackthorne would carry more weight than anyone else's, and his expression as he approached suggested that opinion was still forming. "Captain Blackthorne," he said, his voice carrying the neutral tone of someone conducting official business. "Colonel Harrison wants to see you in the command post, something about mission parameters for tomorrow's operation." His eyes flicked to the target still hanging from the frames downrange, taking in the evidence of what had just transpired without comment. "Staff Sergeant Cooper, secure the range and prepare the men for afternoon patrol briefings." As the Marines began to disperse, their conversations continued to buzz with speculation about what they had witnessed and what it might mean for the operation that everyone knew was coming, but no one was supposed to discuss. Captain Blackthorne handed her rifle back to Staff Sergeant Cooper with the same respectful care she had shown throughout the exercise, but now the gesture carried different weight. Cooper accepted the weapon with something approaching reverence, as if it had been transformed by what had just occurred. "Captain," Cooper said as she prepared to leave for her meeting with the colonel, "thank you for the demonstration. It's been educational." His words carried layers of meaning that both of them understood. This hadn't been about marksmanship training. It had been about establishing credibility, earning respect, and proving that assumptions based on appearance could be dangerously wrong. As Captain Blackthorne walked toward the command post, the Marines watched her go with new eyes. The woman who had been the subject of their amusement 30 minutes earlier was now someone who had earned their respect through the most fundamental currency that warriors understood: demonstrated competence under pressure. The laughter had died, replaced by the kind of professional acknowledgement that couldn't be faked or manufactured. The command post at FOB Kestrel occupied a reinforced concrete structure that had been built by Soviet engineers decades earlier and modified by successive waves of American forces. Inside, banks of communication equipment hummed quietly while duty officers monitored radio traffic from patrols scattered across the province. Colonel Harrison occupied a corner office that served as both his headquarters and his living space, its walls covered with maps marked in red ink that traced the movements of enemy forces and the planned routes of coalition operations. Captain Blackthorne's knock on the doorframe was answered by a gruff invitation to enter. Colonel Harrison looked up from a collection of satellite photographs spread across his desk, his weathered face showing the strain of commanding an isolated outpost in one of Afghanistan's most contested regions. At 53, he had served in every major conflict since Panama, and his judgment had been shaped by the kind of hard experience that couldn't be taught in staff colleges. "Captain," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat in the metal chair across from his desk, "I understand you've been making quite an impression on my Marines." His tone was neutral, but his eyes held the calculating look of someone trying to determine whether the rumors he had been hearing were accurate or exaggerated. Staff Sergeant Cooper says you can shoot. How much of that is military courtesy and how much is fact? The question was more complex than it appeared. Colonel Harrison needed to know not just whether Captain Blackthorne was competent with a rifle, but whether she possessed the kind of skills that would be essential for the mission he was about to outline. The intelligence reports spread across his desk painted a picture of an operation that would require precision, courage, and the ability to perform under pressure that few people could sustain. "I can hit what I aim at, Colonel," Raven replied, her answer carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had proven herself in circumstances more demanding than a training range. "Whether that's good enough depends on what you need me to hit." Her eyes moved to the satellite photographs on his desk, taking in details with the trained eye of someone who had learned to read terrain from both the air and the ground. Colonel Harrison studied her for a long moment, weighing what he knew about her classified record against what he could observe sitting across from him. The mission briefing materials in his safe painted a picture of an operation that required skills rarely found in a single individual, someone who could coordinate air and ground operations, who understood both the capabilities and limitations of different weapon systems, and who could make split-second decisions when communication with higher command was impossible. "Tell me about your background, Captain," he said, settling back in his chair. "Not the official version, the real one. What brought you to my little corner of paradise, and why does your personnel file have more black ink than actual information?" His question was direct in the way that only combat veterans could manage, cutting through military protocol to get at the truth that mattered. Captain Blackthorne considered how much to reveal, knowing that her answer would determine not just Colonel Harrison's opinion of her capabilities, but whether he would trust her with the lives of his Marines in the operation that was clearly coming. "I've been flying combat missions for 8 years, she began, her voice steady and professional. "Started with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, then moved to direct action support for various classified programs. My call sign is Phoenix." The transformation in Colonel Harrison's expression was immediate and dramatic. Phoenix wasn't just a call sign in the special operations community. It was a legend. Phoenix was the pilot who had extracted a trapped reconnaissance team from Kunar Province under fire so intense that the mission had been written off as impossible. Phoenix was the pilot who had provided close air support for a Delta Force operation in Somalia that had saved 30 hostages and eliminated a high-value target that had evaded capture for 3 years. Phoenix was also the pilot who had been shot down over the Kandahar province 6 months earlier, survived 12 days behind enemy lines, and walked out with intelligence that had led to the dismantling of an entire terrorist network. The official reports of that incident were classified so highly that Colonel Harrison had only heard rumors, but those rumors had been enough to establish Phoenix as one of the most respected pilots in the special operations community. "Jesus Christ," Colonel Harrison said, his professional composure slipping for just a moment. "You're that Phoenix." He looked at the woman sitting across from his desk with new understanding, recognizing that he wasn't just dealing with a skilled pilot but with someone whose reputation had preceded her into legend. "No wonder your file reads like a redacted novel. What the hell are you doing at my outpost, Captain?" The question carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. Fob Kestrel was important, but it wasn't the kind of strategic location that typically attracted pilots of Phoenix's caliber. Her presence suggested that something significant was developing, something that required the kind of expertise that couldn't be found through normal channels. Colonel Harrison found himself recalibrating his understanding of the mission parameters that had been handed down from regional command. Captain Blackthorne Phoenix leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. "There's a weapons cache in the mountains northeast of here," she said, her voice dropping to the level of conversation reserved for operational discussions. "Surface-to-air missiles, probably Russian-made, definitely advanced enough to threaten any aircraft operating in this province. Intelligence suggests the cache is being moved within the next 72 hours to a location where recovery would be impossible. Colonel Harrison nodded, confirming what he had suspected from the moment Phoenix had arrived at his base. "And you're here to make sure that doesn't happen," he said, not really asking a question so much as stating a conclusion that had become obvious. "What do you need from me and my Marines, Captain?" The question opened the door to a conversation that would define the next phase of operations at FOB Kestrel. Phoenix spread her own set of photographs on Colonel Harrison's desk, these showing terrain features and enemy positions with the kind of detail that only came from personal reconnaissance. "The cache is located in a valley that's too narrow for traditional bombing runs and too well defended for a simple ground assault," she explained, her finger tracing routes on the aerial photographs. "However," she continued, "there's a window of opportunity when the weapons are being moved from their current location to vehicles for transport. During that window, they'll be exposed and vulnerable, but only for approximately 15 minutes. Missing that window means losing the entire cache to a network that has already demonstrated the ability to down coalition aircraft." Colonel Harrison studied the photographs with the eye of someone who had planned and executed dozens of similar operations. The terrain was challenging, the enemy positions were well chosen, and the timeline was unforgiving. It was exactly the kind of operation that required perfect coordination between air and ground forces, the kind of precision that couldn't be achieved through radio communication alone. "You want to be on the ground when it happens," he said, understanding the implication immediately. "I want to be where I can coordinate the air strike with precision that can't be achieved from 30,000 feet," Phoenix replied. "Which means being close enough to mark targets with a laser designator, close enough to adjust fire in real time, and close enough to make sure that when the ordnance hits, it hits exactly what it's supposed to hit and nothing else." The complexity of what she was proposing settled over Colonel Harrison like a weight. Phoenix wasn't just asking to observe the operation. She was asking to be inserted into hostile territory with his Marines, to coordinate an airstrike while under fire, and to extract safely with intelligence that could reshape the entire operational picture in Kandahar province. It was the kind of mission that could end careers if it went wrong, but could also save hundreds of lives if it went right. "What kind of support do you need?" he asked, his question carrying the weight of someone who had already decided to commit his resources to the operation. The shooting demonstration at the range had been impressive, but this conversation had revealed something far more important. Phoenix wasn't just a skilled pilot, she was a strategic asset whose presence at FOB Kestrel represented an opportunity that might not come again. Phoenix smiled for the first time since arriving at the base, her expression showing relief that Colonel Harrison understood both the importance and the complexity of what they were undertaking. "I need your best Marines, Colonel. I need people who can move quietly, shoot accurately, and follow orders even when those orders don't make sense in the moment. Most importantly, I need people who trust each other enough to work with someone they've known for less than a week." The irony of her last statement wasn't lost on either of them. 2 hours earlier, the Marines at FOB Kestrel had been laughing at the idea of Phoenix handling a rifle. Now, she was asking Colonel Harrison to trust her with the lives of his most experienced warriors in an operation that would determine the safety of every aircraft operating in the region. The transformation from mockery to respect had been dramatic, but the next phase would require something even more challenging: absolute trust between people who had no shared history of combat operations. Colonel Harrison stood and moved to a wall map that showed the disposition of forces throughout his area of operations. Red pins marked enemy positions, while blue pins showed friendly forces, creating a pattern that revealed both opportunities and vulnerabilities. "I can give you Gunnery Sergeant Martinez and his best squad," he said, his finger tracing possible routes through the mountain terrain. "They've been operating in this area for 6 months. They know the ground, and they know how to move without being detected. More importantly," he continued, turning back to face Phoenix, They know how to adapt when operations don't go according to plan. Martinez has kept more Marines alive in impossible situations than any other NCO I've served with. If you can earn his trust, his men will follow you through hell and back again. The recommendation carried weight that went beyond professional assessment. It was the kind of endorsement that could only come from someone who had seen Gunnery Sergeant Martinez operate under the worst possible conditions. Phoenix nodded, understanding that earning Martinez's trust would be as crucial as any other aspect of the mission preparation. The shooting demonstration had impressed the Marines, but impressing them and earning their trust in combat were entirely different challenges. "When do we brief the team?" she asked, already shifting her focus to the practical details that would determine whether the operation succeeded or failed. "Tonight," Colonel Harrison replied. "But first, I want you to spend the rest of the day with Martinez and his squad. Learn how they work together, understand their capabilities and limitations, and let them understand yours. This operation is going to require the kind of coordination that can't be achieved through briefing slides and radio communication. You need to know these Marines as well as you know your own aircraft systems." The wisdom of Colonel Harrison's approach was immediately apparent. Phoenix had participated in dozens of joint operations, but she had learned that success depended less on individual skills than on the ability of different specialists to function as a unified team. The Marines who would accompany her into the mountains needed to trust not just her competence, but her judgment under pressure. That kind of trust couldn't be manufactured. It had to be earned through shared experience and demonstrated reliability. As Phoenix prepared to leave Colonel Harrison's office, he called her back with one final question. "Captain, what makes you think this operation is worth the risk we're about to take?" His question wasn't a challenge to her judgment, but rather the kind of final verification that experienced commanders sought before committing their people to dangerous missions. Phoenix paused in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the harsh Afghan sunlight streaming through the command post windows. "Because, Colonel, every day we leave those missiles in enemy hands is another day that Marines die when their air support gets shot out of the sky. Every pilot who doesn't come home, every medevac that gets turned away, every close air support mission that can't be completed, it all traces back to weapons like the one sitting in that cache." Her words carried the weight of personal experience, the knowledge that came from watching friends disappear in fireballs or crash land in hostile territory, because the enemy had tools that should never have been available to them. Colonel Harrison nodded, recognizing that Phoenix wasn't just proposing a mission. She was offering to prevent a tragedy that had probably already claimed lives in other theaters of operation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Fob Kestrel as Captain Phoenix Blackthorn made her way to the squad bay, where Gunnery Sergeant Martinez and his Marines had gathered for what they believed would be a routine equipment inspection. The irony wasn't lost on Phoenix. She was about to ask these Marines to trust her with their lives in an operation that none of them had been briefed on yet, based on a reputation that most of them had never heard of and skills that they had only witnessed for 20 minutes on a shooting range. Gunnery Sergeant Martinez stood as she entered the squad bay, his posture reflecting the automatic respect that military protocol demanded, but not yet the personal trust that successful operations required. Around him, 8 Marines continued their equipment maintenance with the kind of focused attention that suggested they had been warned to make a good impression. Their gear was laid out in precise arrays that spoke of professional competence and attention to detail. Exactly what Phoenix needed for an operation where a single overlooked piece of equipment could doom the entire mission. "Gunnery Sergeant," Phoenix said, her voice carrying the tone of someone initiating a professional conversation rather than a social interaction. "Colonel Harrison suggested I spend some time with your squad before tonight's briefing. Learn how you operate, understand your capabilities." She paused, her eyes moving across the Marines with the assessing gaze of someone who needed to quickly understand the strengths and weaknesses of potential teammates. Martinez nodded, his weathered face revealing nothing about his thoughts regarding this unusual request. "Marines," he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet conversations that had been taking place throughout the squad bay. "Gear inspection is postponed. Captain Blackthorn wants to understand how we work. Lance Corporal Hayes, walk her through our communication setup. Corporal Thompson, show her our heavy weapons capabilities. The rest of you, answer any questions she has about your specialties." The transformation in the squad bay was immediate and professional. The Marines shifted from equipment maintenance to demonstration mode, their movements becoming more purposeful as they prepared to showcase the capabilities that had kept them alive through 6 months of operations in one of Afghanistan's most dangerous provinces. Phoenix watched the transition with approval, recognizing the signs of a unit that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Lance Corporal Hayes approached first, carrying a radio system that looked far more sophisticated than the standard equipment Phoenix had expected to find at a forward operating base. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the careful respect of someone who had heard rumors about what happened at the shooting range but wasn't sure what to make of them yet. "This is our primary communication setup. We've got satellite communication capability, encrypted channels for coordination with air assets, and backup systems in case our primary equipment gets damaged." Phoenix examined the radio with the practiced eye of someone who understood that communication was the lifeline that connected ground forces to the support systems that kept them alive. "What's your typical range for coordination with close air support?" she asked, her question revealing knowledge of operational procedures that impressed Hayes despite his attempt to remain professionally neutral. "Depends on terrain and atmospheric conditions," Hayes replied, his answer becoming more detailed as he recognized that Phoenix understood the technical aspects of what he was describing. "In these mountains, line-of-sight communication with aircraft can be challenging, but we've got workarounds that usually maintain contact even in the worst conditions. The real challenge is coordinating between ground forces and air assets when the timing has to be perfect." His last comment carried implications that weren't lost on Phoenix. Hayes was describing exactly the kind of challenge that the upcoming operation would present: the need to coordinate precision airstrikes while operating in terrain that made communication